and with music.
Are we putting you on a plane after this?
Sorry.
To the airport.
Okay.
But I get to see a couple people first.
We just have an OHS video from our venue partners that we've been asked to play. It's trying to get the volume, sufficiently loud, and then we'll be on our way. Thank you for your patience.
Just let me know if you need me to narrate it.
I prefer an interpretive dance.
No smoking, no.
Just one more over. That's it then. Okay, click on it and I'll show you. And then we'll demonstrate it. Thank you so much. Okay, now we can play. Yep. Thank you so much.
Premier heritage venue space. The centre is a smoke-free environment. Please refrain from smoking at all times anywhere in or near the building, including balconies and outdoor areas. We are currently in the Victoria Room, located on the fourth floor of the building. Please familiarise yourself with the layout of the room and note the two emergency exits. Women's restrooms and a unisex accessible restroom can be found at the top right side of the room. The men's restroom can be found at the top left of the room. There are additional male, female and accessible restrooms on the ground level at the rear of the building just behind the lift. Please note the emergency exits. In the event of an emergency evacuation, proceed to the emergency meeting point, the steps of the Victoria State Library on Smarston Street. Persons who are unable to descend the stairs should be accompanied to the fire-safe stairwell door by the men's toilets, or if this area is unsafe, outside the lift in the foyer area to await assistance or emergency services. While evacuating the building, walk calmly, do not run and do not use mobile phones while descending the stairs. In the event of an evacuation, make your way toward the Victoria State Library. Remain there until further instructions are given by emergency services.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Feminist Lounge, ladies and gentlemen.
We're all good, Hannah? We'll start our live stream. Welcome to the 2018 Feminist Writers Festival. My name's Christy Clark. I'm the co-chair of the festival. I want to acknowledge that our festival is being held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation and to pay my respects to them as traditional owners and to their elders past, present and emerging, and the elders from any other communities who might be with us today. I also want to acknowledge that today is National Sorry Day and to give my personal and our institutional apology for past and ongoing wrongs, including the removal of Indigenous children in this country. Thank you so much for coming along this afternoon to our session, Writing Violence and Writing Change. Obviously, this is a topic that's been all over the media lately due to the Me Too movement, but it is a much broader topic, and our three fabulous panellists will be exploring it from a range of different angles today. We, of course, need to highlight that this session will involve the discussion of violence against women, including in the home and other subjects that could potentially be triggering to people in the audience. So please look after yourselves, and please feel free to step out at any point if you need to take a moment, and our volunteers will assist you in finding a safe space for that as well. Before we get started, I'm going to ask everyone to turn their phones onto silent because we're both recording and live streaming the event today. But we'd love to hear from you, so do join in the conversation on either Facebook or Twitter using the hashtag FWF2018. I have three fabulous panellists to introduce you to today. Jessamy Gleeson, here, has recently completed her PhD with a specific focus on feminist activism online. She now works at RMIT on an ARC-funded grant examining image-based sexual abuse online. Jessamy has previously been on the organising teams at Slutwalk Melbourne, Cherchez la Femme, and Girls on Film Festival. Welcome, Jessamy.
Thanks.
Tasneem Chopra was named one of the Herald Sun's 50 Women You Need to Know in 2017. So now you've caught up.
No. That was last year, now it doesn't matter now.
Can we turn the slide off at the back? Yanrong, is that okay? If we could get that off, just so it's not in eyes. Thank you. As well as writing and presenting across a range of media, she's now board director for Ambulance Victoria, ACMI, the Luke Batty Foundation, Now Australia, and chair of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. That's a lot.
Busy.
Welcome, Tasneem. Tara Moss is the author of 11 books and has produced, wrote and hosted the documentary Cyber Hate for the ABC. She's a doctoral candidate at the University of Sydney and is the recipient of an Edna Ryan Award for her significant contribution to feminist debate. Welcome, Tara. I'll mention this again at the end, but I just want to let you know, Tara's on a bit of a tight schedule today in relation to a flight. So we're going to pull our session back a little to allow a bit of time for signing, but it will be quite tight. And at that point, we will be escorting her from the building no matter how tightly and how much she would like to spend time with you. We will not permit that. So my apologies in advance for anyone who feels cut off. And I know that for this particular topic, that could be hard. I just want to flag that so people can work through it.
And please reach me online. I don't have a business card, but it could be like Tara Moss, the internet. I'm easy to find. If we get cut off today for any reason and you wanted to chat with me about something, please reach me online. I'll be very welcome to hear from you.
And I'm also going to be taking questions about an hour into our session today. So we'll have a lovely discussion. I'll ask you to hold your questions for then, and then I'm going to ask you to come up the front for them, for the benefit of our live stream and the miking situation. And that'll just be down here and we'll have a handheld mic for you. So save them up for then. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to you, Jessamy. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. All right, so I have a variety of questions, as I'm sure you do. I wanted to quickly just frame a few terms before we jump into things. I can't help it, I'm an academic, bear with me. So what we identify as violence. So the three things I had down were physical, emotional, economic. Have I missed anything? Is there, I mean, I'm sure there's more, but when I think about violence and when we write about violence, there's obviously physical violence, which is the big one that comes up. There's emotional violence and economic as well.
I think that's all really relevant, and for our purposes, obviously, we need to make the net, small in a sense. I think in the context of what is historically happening in Ireland at the moment, I would add kind of like medical violence or institutional violence, legal violence. But I think for today, we'll try to focus on that kind of most often thought of version of violence against women, because that in a topic of itself is massive.
And I think there's also scope in adding to that psychological violence.
Oh yeah,
it does differ away from emotional. It's a bit more nuanced, and to an extent, we use the term of cultural violence, but I think it needs to be unpacked a little bit too.
Yeah, okay, excellent. And when we talk about writing about violence as well, I think today we talked earlier about covering fiction, non-fiction, writing in the media, outside of the media and online as well. So we'll try and cover a bit of that. I wanted to kick off, and the first thing I wanted to ask was, obviously violence is written about not necessarily well everywhere. I'm sure we've seen terrible, examples of this. But are awards and recognition for people that discuss violence in the media beneficial? So I mentioned earlier, and I'm sure a few people here are aware of things like the Staunch Prize, which was announced a few months ago, and it said it was going to be awarded to the author of a novel in the thriller genre in which no woman is beaten, stalked, sexually exploited, raped, or murdered. So I wanted to get your reactions to that.
I love it. I'm a crime writer and I love it, but I'll also say probably none of my novels will ever be eligible, right? And I'm not going to apologize for that because I'm going to write about violence against women, and that's important to me. But I like that it just illuminates this particular issue. Like, when was the last time you read a book in this genre that didn't include particularly this kind of violence against women and girls? It exists in real life and should be written about, but again, how should it be written about? Is it the only plot line we have? You know, so I think questioning that is wonderful, and I like that the prize is out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, there's gratuitous violence, and which I think if that applied to, there's a lot of merit in that. And we did toy with the idea of applying this, it's like a Bechdel test for writers in a way. But if we applied it to male writers in particular, how would that look? Would that be interesting? Because we know, well, Tara even mentioned that there's particularly a gratuitous effect that happens when we see a lot of male writers take up the violence against women trope writing, and if they were held to a standard that challenged a lot of the way they write, that could produce something that was quite interesting.
And different. And I think that's what that prize is about, is actually pointing out that it would be really different to see novels in this genre that don't don't rely on the rape and murder of women. Now, there's a lot of that out there.
In order to drive characters or character development or growth.
And is that done lazily? You know, is that done lazily? Is it being done well? Is it helpful in some way, as well as being, yes, a form of entertainment? It's a novel, you know, it's not a speech, but are there ways to do it that are more positive than others? And being someone who's been in this genre for 20 years, yes. So I totally support the Staunch Prize. I think it's a great idea. It's not going to change everything, but it does really make you question what you see all the time.
I am interested to see what kind of nominations they actually get, and I would definitely read those books. But
is that a national prize or an international?
I think it's international, so I'd have to have a look and see what they actually get nominated, or like what's nominated in the end. But the opposite of that as well is there was, I'm not sure if it still exists, but for a while there was an award in which violence is written about sensitively and well, and it was to do with media reporting mainly, so not fiction, but reports of media and violence, and it was to recognise that obviously we can write about violence, but there are certain approaches that may work better than others. And again, what are your opinions on that, or what do you think, what approaches do work well? I mean, I'm sure everyone here knows that there are some ways in which you can report on violence that are more sensitive than others, but for both of you, what do you keep at the forefront of your mind when you're reading these reports? What is good, what is bad, what should go to this award?
Well, immediately, the way that the women's experience of violence is framed, whether it's victimhood or whether the framing of a particular report is done to favour the humanisation of the perpetrator, like a good bloke.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of culpability, I think, in the way that media does frame responses, whether or not the comments are actually genuine. There is still a responsibility to the readership and to the sensitivity and the ethics of violence against women, which gets overlooked for sensationalism all the time. So I think there needs to be some sort of staunch award for media at that level. Not even an award, it should be an expectation. It should be a requirement that the victimhood of females is not diminished for the sale of a title, or the sale of a headline.
You don't want it to be clickbait. It deserves much better treatment than that. And I think that brings to mind something like the Our Watch Awards for media reporting. And I do think it's valid and helpful because it's pointing out good examples. Like at one of those awards I was at, I think it was Hitting Home that won. You know, and that was a really tough, real, well-handled documentary, you know? So you don't need an award to make a documentary like that, but it's nice to recognize good work when you see it and to show the good examples. And on the flip side, I love Jane Gilmore's Fixed It series because she's pointing out, well, actually she does also now make a point of looking at the good examples when she goes, wow, someone really got this right, this is fabulous. But the Fixed It series is really focused on fixing those bad headlines, like no, it wasn't an ally that was raped, it was a woman. You know, no, you don't need to take that quote and make it a victim-blaming headline about how women should stay in groups when, you know, the police officer, I think it was a senior sergeant, very specifically said, my main message here is to the perpetrators that, you know, an impaired person cannot give consent. You know, a person who can't give consent, you know, that's not sex, that's assault. You know, this is the sort of thing that should be in the headline. So it's disappointing when you see, you know, the media making a choice not to make that the focus of the article. Again, it's like women stay in groups. Again, it's always up to us. It's always the onus is always put on the victim. Why wasn't she in a group? You know, why was she drinking? Why was she in that short skirt, you know? So while those attitudes might still exist in the community, you know, maybe don't make that the norm by keeping it constantly in the headline. Maybe use the examples that are much more powerful, much more positive.
As media and comms tutor, amongst many other things, where does the responsibility for that lie? At what stage do we intervene or say to journalists or media students or wherever else, you're reporting this incorrectly? There are guidelines in place nationally that are to do with things around the reporting of suicide and that kind of stuff. Where do we intervene into that process of journalists reporting it wrong? And things like Jane Gilmore, like Fixed It's great. Yeah. She's not getting paid for that. She's not getting paid for that. That's free labour.
Join her Patreon because she should.
Pay her because she's not getting paid for it. Yeah. But with that kind of stuff, where does the responsibility lie, or where do you view that intervention could take place in which we can better shape that kind of reporting?
Editors. Editors. And I say that without hesitation, having done training programs on cultural diversity and nuances of culturally balanced reporting. And journalists will turn up, reporters will turn up, and they'll write pieces. But then once they're filed, they're tweaked. And once they're tweaked, they're presented in a certain way. And all the integrity in that piece is often lost with a shoddy headline and a bad image.
Yes.
And it always comes down to editors. But getting editors to the table to a cultural diverse training session is really like getting, you know, a lot of, you know, senior members of parliament on board with a, you know, human rights session. So there are certain challenges which continue, but we know where the culpability lies. So, I mean, I'm open to strategies of enticing editors. You know, whether it becomes some sort of industry standard they have to maintain, some sort of ethics committee they have to report to. I don't know, the judiciary. I'm open to anything. But that's, in my experience, that's where the buck stops.
And I think that we do need to give a shout out to the fact that we have a lot of journalists who are trying really hard to report these stories well. Like, I would even say that's probably the majority, but like you said, things get tweaked, headlines get changed. It's happened to me. I will often end up contacting a publication saying, whoa, you've made this into a controversial headline. There's none of that in the article. Can we please talk about this and maybe change that headline? Because it appears as if the writer has written it, and that's not the case. But also keeping in mind that, the editor, the buck stops there, but there's often like quite a number of people that passes who no one twigs before it gets sent out. Like, wow, that really shouldn't be written that way. And also picture editors, there's another fun thing. You know, like, deadlines are tight, but we can do better sometimes with just the way we're representing the stories. Even when this foundational writing is actually, has a lot of merit, it can get lost before it's read by the public.
Yeah. And my answer is a bit separate as well, because I'm from, academia, but there's such a pushback within academia from what I've seen. Again, some people are trying to do it well and train journalist students well. When I went through in 2008, there was nothing. There were no, I'm hoping it's changed now, but there was very little in the way of training students to respond sensitively when discussing violence. In the same way that we had a whole couple of lectures in that on reporting suicide, there was nothing to do with women. And when I went back years later and asked for us to include something, it was just no, we're not interested in that. But there are frameworks in place to complain and that kind of stuff as well. But again, I think when you're getting paid as an editor to do it, it's a lot easier. Yeah. So just to go back to fiction for a minute, so to go back to crime writing and that kind of stuff, Tara, you mentioned that none of your novels would necessarily pass this test of being nominated for the Staunch Prize.
Well, I guess none of the crime novels.
None of the crime novels,
The paranormal, yeah, totally. My main character gets put in lots of really difficult situations that are paranormal in nature, and she, you know, rises above and is amazing. Sometimes literally rising, but that's another story. Within the crime genre, I have tried to, I guess, take up the mantle of this particular subgenre within the crime genre itself, and then put my own spin on it and create a very powerful woman who, you know, survives. So in that way, those aspects of the plot are really integral. Like I wouldn't take those out, and I wouldn't change that. But it is different probably than what you're going to see if you pick up a novel that's maybe not written by a woman. There's lots of great male crime writers as well, but maybe not written by a woman, maybe not written by a woman who's experienced violence. And maybe, you know, there are subtle differences there, maybe sometimes not so subtle. So I don't want to kind of say, hey, everyone else gets to write this genre except us now because we're trying to be really ethically.
My question is, who does get to write that?
Yeah.
Who gets to sell or explore these stories
Yes.
in fiction? So explorations of violence. Who has that right or claim to be able to write about that in a way that's effective?
I think it's a really tricky topic. I think that because violence exists in the world, we should write about it, and we should have it in our art, and we should have it in our media, and we should have these discussions open. And there's no perfect crime novel and no perfect feminist and no perfect media article, but I think being sensitive to what is involved, to the stakes involved, and kind of how you're representing things is just a really good project. I haven't perfected it myself, but I think it's a really worthwhile project to keep looking at it, and keep looking at how you can tell that story beautifully and really make it powerful and compelling without exploiting people unnecessarily, I mean, in this case, fictional people, but it connects with real life. It's not really fiction because we're talking about human beings and things that happen. But yeah, I agree, it's like a tricky area.
Tasneem, what about you? Because there's such an appetite for stories of, you know, women of colour being exploited in literature and that kind of stuff as well. And it can be really harmful, but at the same time, they're really important stories if told well.
I think there's that fine line between fiction and ethics.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we do have crime in the world and people are going to write about it. People are good writers. But the ethics come into it when, and you can't impose this and you can't police it or mandate it, but you would want, in an ideal world, for writers to recheck their intentions. So am I writing this because it's got contextual relevance to the story, or is it just like, it's great clickbait, people are going to love it, it's, it's, in a way it feeds into violent pornography, and so that's what's going to sell my book, and so I need to make sure I can, it's all about the money, for want of a better term. So I think if we recheck, and like I said, there's no way to police that, how you recheck intentions, then I think that would obliterate a lot of the fluff.
Yeah, I agree.
And it's considering, I guess, too, where you are positioned in this debate as well. So for me, when I was writing my PhD as a, as a woman of colour but white presenting and that kind of stuff, the different privileges that exist there and existing inside of a university, so being very privileged in order to do the PhD, I had to be a little bit reflexive about what I was writing about and who it was going to benefit. So where is my work going? Is it going to go, filed away in a library in which other privileged people can get to it and no one actually learns anything from it? Or am I going to be able to put it out there in which people can access it freely and actually apply it? Which in the case of researching feminist campaigns, you want it to be applied because you're actually there to further the cause.
Yep.
So thinking about where you sit in that debate, I guess, is really important to what you're writing it for, what your intentions are.
And I think with non-fiction, it's a very strong sort of leaning, and it should be.
Yeah. And in fiction, there's this wonderful history of great feminist crime writer women like Partesky, like Bland, like she wrote the first African-American police officer in a detective novel, you know, or Carrie Greenwood with Franny Fisher, and she deals with a lot of different social issues and injustices within the context of entertaining fiction. But she's breaking boundaries, and she's using that genre very cleverly. And I think that does have power. I think that it is relevant. And, you know, again, it's not a speech, it's not a piece of nonfiction, but it's really effective. And sometimes that can be the most effective way to change minds, is to do it through art. I do think that's potentially very powerful, and I know that for me as a reader, it's often been more powerful even to be watching the movie or reading the book and getting that feeling of like the change, the progress, and yes, that feeling of empowerment, the overused wonderful word. Perhaps that will be even more powerful sometimes for us than reading about the nonfiction, very important media article.
Yeah, it can be much more accessible. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's across advocacy and human rights, and not just in this space.
I wanted to ask as well, because we have seen how writing can, as you say, really affect change and that kind of stuff. Can you think of any media texts, so, you know, books, films, whatever, that have actually done that well? So, you know, as viewers and consumers, what have you seen that you've said, that's great, I love that, that's really shifted my worldview, or that story has, you know, subverted things? So, yeah, what have you seen?
The first thing that comes to mind is Handmaid's Tale.
Yep.
Only because I look at that and I look at the political relevance. For me, that's the link. The violence is there, obviously, but I think it speaks to the broader topics of control and you know, where women's position is in society in a dystopic future, which is it the future or is it now? So that particular story. I haven't read the book though. I have to admit, I didn't read the book. I've just seen the series adapted, and it really struck me as a very powerful telling of where violence can end when it's institutionalized to the end point.
Yeah, what it looks like.
Yeah, the Margaret Atwood book is incredible.
It is phenomenal.
And highly recommended. I would go back to some of my crime writing heroines there, just in terms of like how they've taken a genre that I love, you know, I am a thriller lover, and made it into a story about these women that are powerful and smart. And, you know, look back at Nancy Drew. At the time, that was revolutionary. You know, it was, and it set the path for many of us decades on, because it was for the first time, you know, you were seeing a female protagonist who was figuring everything out and saving the day. And it's not directly focused on violence against women, but I just want to like talk about Ghostbusters for a second.
Oh yeah. I'm not going to oppose that.
because I watched the wonderful reboot, and at the end I was like, gosh, I'm feeling really emotional. What's happening here? What's going on? And I realized that I'm a middle-aged woman, and and I watch a lot of film. I'm a huge consumer of film and novels. I had never before seen on film a gang of women save the world. Had never seen it.
Yeah, I felt
it blew my mind. I'd seen some individual examples that we started really seeing in the 90s of individual women, like Ripley, like Buffy, you know, who were saving the world. We saw that start, but the kind of like the pal gang story of a group of people saving the world has always been male identifying characters, always. And we've seen it so many times, it's not even remarkable. We've seen it for decades and decades and decades, and it's like, of course, yeah, it seems really obvious. But I realized watching that, oh my God, I'm like a 44-year-old woman watching, finally, a first example on film of women saving the world. You know, not in a real life type scenario, but how powerful that is. Like just thinking, gosh, I've not ever seen this before. And, you know, this is contemporary stuff. So I think there's lots of ways to do this. And sometimes it can be very far from real life, but it can still have an impact whether we immediately identify it when it's happening or not. It does change minds, it changes perspectives, and it changes the story.
It speaks to possibility too,
It
and I
does,
think
yeah.
with Handmaid's Tale, that was a red flag of like, watch out, well, this could be us. I think with Ghostbusters, I see that, and I think even with Black Panther, there was a reimagination of what the world would look like if it was not written by the hegemony.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
in a word.
Yeah.
And understanding that media has effects and impacts, which again people disagree with all the time. But yes, that representations are important.
Yes.
Different representations are important. We need more diversity when it comes to film, media, TV, books, that kind of stuff.
I haven't seen the new Star Wars, but Thandie Newton, I'm aware, wore a red carpet dress made by Vivienne Westwood with all of the action figure characters of the black characters who'd existed in the Star Wars franchise. They were all male. She was the first black woman
Yep.
involved in a Star Wars series who wasn't CGI, so I don't know.
Yes.
I'm not thinking of exactly what that example would have
Lupita
been.
in the latest ones was CGI.
Okay,
yeah,
gotcha.
Lupita Nyong'o, yeah.
So she was like, I'm the first, and
woman.
here are all these, but the difference that makes, actually, like just in terms of representation. Yes, it's Star Wars, it's fiction, it's fun, it's entertainment, but representation matters. And representation really matters when we're talking about this violence against women's subject.
Yes.
The women need to be present, their voices need to be present, and that's often removed from the media article or the novel writing.
Yeah, exactly. How do we, when we talk about violence in writing and the expectations that we may have of survivors, we, expect them to come out and talk about these experiences. We expect them to do it not once, but many times over and over again. Tell us what happened to you. Tell us in explicit detail what went wrong. All of these questions that we know are problematic and awful. But how do we approach these expectations, of wanting to hear from survivors, wanting their voices involved in these discussions, not wanting them silenced, against the risk of re-traumatizing them? How do we do that effectively? My answer first up is, don't do it unless they want to be involved. Pay them.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Pay them.
At a basic,
them.
at a minimum, absolutely. And I mean, it comes back to check your intentions. What's this for? Why are we doing this? Is it actually going to enhance the cause? Is it going to serve us as a society to hear this again?
Yeah.
If we're hearing the same thing again and again, and we're not hearing anything different, so how is that actually changing? Are we not learning?
Yeah, if we're hearing it
We
over
keep
and
hearing
over
the same
again.
thing again. So I think we need to look at that as well. But yeah, the emotional and traumatic costs, and I look at what Rosie Batty has gone through, having to retell her trauma, I don't know,
And now she's
thousands of times to the point where she needs to step back. I'm surprised she did it, for as long as she has done it, because in that particular realm of sharing such incredibly personal trauma, I think the cost of that to the person is often overlooked by even well-meaning people who are wanting to support the cause. And I think we can support the cause without re-traumatizing the victim.
Yep.
I think the really important part of that is to let the survivor decide. Because we don't want to take the work or opportunity away from that person and go, oh, well, she won't be able to handle that.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's a whole other issue. Like, I'll just assume she can't do this anymore or that this would be too much. Let them decide, but do it mindfully. Think about the context of the interview. Think about your questions. I know for me, being interviewed, I've got all ends of the spectrum. I got like, do you forgive your rapist? Like on live TV.
Oh my God.
I'm like, I don't know, ask all 12 of us. Like, do we really need, is that really what you demand of us? That we go, yeah, he's fine, he's a nice guy, But to kind of like spring that on live TV. But then on the other end, people who clearly were following all the protocols, like to interview the person in an environment in which they're familiar, in their home if they allow that, or some other place that they have chosen. To have a discussion with them beforehand about boundaries, about terminology. That it actually can mean a lot to some of us to be called a survivor or a victim, and both are relevant.
Yes.
And both are valid. But to basically let the person tell their story and have them be the
having agency in what happens.
having agency. And so I wouldn't want us to go, oh, we don't want to have them tell their story anymore, because that I'm going to just make that decision for them. We have to, again, have the decision be theirs. And Tasneem's already kind of touched on this. It's the ridiculousness of the fact that we need to keep telling the stories. That is the biggest thing here, like how amazing it is that these traumas have to be retold just for us to acknowledge that they exist.
How many times?
Like how many studies, how many of the numbers do we have to look at? How many decades does it have to go on before we all kind of just get, this is really bad and it's happening all the time, so that we don't actually require the tears and incredibly intimate details from an individual survivor in order to write our check.
And it's not because we have amnesia, it's because we're complacent. I mean, if we were actually forgetting, that's one thing, but we just like, well, tell us again, tell us again. It's like, pay attention, this has happened,
Yeah. And there's a difference too in asking, as you mentioned earlier, women of colour, again, or different token experiences, pulling them in over and over again for the sake of diversity or whatever else, and the exhaustion at a whole different level that women experience because they're there to be the token, woman of colour, the token queer woman, the token women who is disabled to tell their stories again and have that experience define them to an extent. Yeah, that's really important, I think. I wanted to ask, on the other end of this, so people telling their stories to others, but as we're all writers outside of this, how we approach this whilst looking after ourselves. So not just having people tell their stories, but from the other end, hearing these stories over and over again and reporting on them, writing about them, researching them. How do we approach that in a way, not that it's just sensitive because we've explored that, but from a perspective of self-care as well? What can we do to ensure we're looking after ourselves and others that are doing this kind of work?
I'll you speak to that.
Well, I wrote a big section in Speaking Out at my most recent book on self-care because of this issue, and it's been very instructive and illuminating for me since The Fictional Woman came out in 2014, because it was a 300-plus page book, and the media focused very much on the page where I talked about how I had been sexually assaulted, and because that was part of my experience, and it was a book about women's experiences, and wow, leaving that out would be a big gap and not necessarily helpful. But by doing that, of course, a whole other chain of events began, and there's a lot of things to look at, decisions to make when you come public with a story, things that shouldn't still be a factor but are. It's going to get reinterpreted here and there. The story will be taken out of your hands and told by others and changed, and your voice might even be taken out of that, which I literally found in articles. There was one writer who contacted the convicted rapist for a quote and didn't include any of my quotes, didn't ask me for comment, but also didn't even quote any of the things that were in the book that the thing was, it was just complete removal of the woman's voice from the story. That's, kind of the reason we know about the story is the woman spoke about it. So it's that kind of removal of your own voice and own agency in your own story, which can be very, very challenging and in some cases really, really a problem. But I included a big section on self-care because even if, those of us who work in advocacy who haven't personally experienced the things we're touching on when we're advocates, what we're hearing is still really often very heavy stuff. It can be really heavy lifting, and it's extraordinarily important work, and there's not enough support to help us to continue going. And usually it pays zero or very little, and it's often those jobs that are the most important for our communities, So it's looking at all of that, really appreciating what people go through and looking at ways that we can practice great self-care to just keep going, because I want to be in it long term. I want you to be in it long term. I don't want you to burn out. And at the moment, the way the power structures are set up, the way the system works, it's kind of like an inevitable train that's going to you're going to burn out and just end up isolated and not able to do your work anymore. And we don't want that. We really, really need you. So that self-care question is incredibly important, and there's no right answer for how to do it. But if we look out for one, it's going to be different for everyone. If you look out for one another and yourself, you have a much better chance of being able to keep going and to recognize when someone else, you know, when their self-care isn't quite working and when they need that added support. And that's why this is a collective, isn't it? 'Cause we can't do it otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about you, Tasneem?
Yeah, look, I mean, much of what you just said, I mean, burnout is real. It's absolute. And I always remember this quote that my mother said as a new migrant to Australia. She used to say to people, you know, it's important that we give and give and give until we have nothing more to give in terms of our ethic. And I'm like, hang on. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that now. I think we need to listen to that little voice in our head. We need to take better care of our mental well-being, our physical well-being, our psychosocial well-being as well, and know that because of the collective, because of the sisterhood or whatever it is, we can delegate, we can share.
Yes.
It's not our responsibility to shoulder the burden of other people's misogyny all the time, or other people's racism, or that's their problem to unpack. And we're invested, as this is our sole purpose in life to demystify. It's extremely taxing mentally and physically as well. So I'd say stop, pace yourself, and share the load.
Yeah. Also be aware, as maybe the other person, if you have a story to tell, just seeing if the person you're about to tell it to is okay at that moment. Is this a good time to talk about it? Because if you were a professional in this field, like say a psychologist, you have particular hours. Of course, you're getting paid for that labor as well, which is another story. And I don't think most of us are necessarily asking for that from readers and fans, but you don't have like hours to clock on and off. And so if I'm going and buying milk and someone turns to me and starts crying and tells me this story, I'm gonna listen to them and I'm going to hear that story, but I'm not going to be prepared. And maybe it's going to be part of what makes it really difficult to keep going. So the fact that, you know, we maybe need to be mindful, and I'll share one of my worst examples, which was spending a lot of time with a group of people in an academic environment, and then having one of them contact me, which was great, and then having one of them, a fellow, contact me and say he wanted to talk to me about this subject over a cup of tea. So I went to the cafe, and he spent an hour telling me about how he'd raped someone.
Oh my God.
And it was just like no, you know, there's so
an out of
many-
body, is this happening?
This is just like I've been hearing this day in and day out, online, in person, everywhere I go, because of that particular moment for me in 2014, where it was just like, you know, now this is what we all want to talk about. Apparently, nothing else in the book is all about this, but just not kind of going, hey, look, this might be really triggering and maybe not appropriate, but I'd like to talk to you about this. No opportunity there. Just kind of, you're sitting down with this person, the story starts, and I go, oh my God, where is this story going? And that's where it's going. And just, you have to be, you know, composed and, okay, well, have a nice day. You know, and then you have to kind of be okay with that. And there's no framework around it. There's no structure around it, because it's not a professional engagement or opportunity or part of your field that you've trained for. And I guess on that note, I'd also say, like, total shout out to the institutions that provide training for people who are advocates or working in this field to deal with things like vicarious trauma, because that's made a huge difference in my life.
Absolutely.
Even institutions, so my work at RMIT involves interviewing survivors of image-based abuse, which often, so when we say image-based abuse, sometimes, I mean, often people think revenge porn. It can be broader than that, but it's often tied up in situations of domestic or family violence as well. So these interviews will go on for hours, and we'll talk about these experiences of image-based abuse that are often tied up in wider things. And even in that professional environment, in a professional capacity of sitting down and doing these interviews, afterwards there are limited opportunities to debrief, and it's not in a counselling role, so we can't help them achieve any outcomes. The outcome is based in our research and forwarding that, you know, pushing forward the agenda in that way. But outside of that, I am not in a counselling role to help anyone else. I'm there to listen and record, provide empathy, sure, but can't actually help them with anything beyond that. So institutions, some places are better than others. Some are just catching up now with providing those services for us to be able to continue the research or the work. Academics are usually very good at internal looking and reflection and that, but this is one area that we're still not getting right all the time.
There's an improvement, but I think that there's also an assumption that if you spoke about something, you're just fine to talk about it, and also any aspect of it, as opposed to where maybe the boundaries that you set initially to say, okay, this is, by the way, boundaries are really important, really important to set. But if you decide, like, these are the things I'm happy to discuss, I'm discussing it for, you know, these particular reasons that I think will be helpful, and you've made that decision, you can't assume then that that person is happy to talk about anything, any time of day, and will just be fine, because that's just not human beings, it's not real life, and it's an unrealistic expectation.
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of Mariah Carey as a result of my work. Just needed something very light to take the edge off.
And
so
I
that's
watch
my personal
Ghostbusters.
strategy.
You know, we all have our ways. We all have our ways. Like, have a bit of fun. And
someone was asking me the other day, how are you coping with all this? And I was like, Mariah Carey, just a lot, all the time. It's very light. It's just something. And on that note of, you know, labour and that kind of stuff, I wanted to get to what, you know, was advertised in here, and it's one of my favourite topics, which is hashtags, and in particular, the labour that goes on when we're writing about violence in online environments, and we're talking about, you know, Me Too, and that kind of work. What are the expectations that we have then of people that are sharing their stories online, and where the boundaries are again different and blurred and people are participating? How can you envision that working well versus maybe not working so well? Because there have been critiques on both, you know, both for and against Me Too, and it's not perfect.
can I just say Harvey Weinstein's in custody?
Yeah.
Like, can we just give a shout out to those over 70 brave women who spoke out against an incredibly powerful individual who had, and in some cases did, ruin careers based on his own agenda and covering himself up. So, huge celebration of the little wins. Lots of problems there, but he's in custody. There's something happening, and we would not be there without all of those women, right? So Me Too, pretty amazing, pretty powerful, but pretty imperfect. You know, support for those individual people, and they also, a lot of them beforehand weren't getting any support either, so it's not new for them. But when you write something in a tweet, you know, there's no one there to go, all right, are you okay? Are you like literally physically safe? You know, it's a really interesting time, because none of that movement would have been remotely necessary had the legal system and criminal justice system been operating correctly. When I say correctly, I mean like with law and, like, you know, criminal stuff not good, let's take you into custody. It just had been failing so many people for so long. That's why we've seen this. But there's an enormous amount of, you know, complication with the way that this is unfolding, of course.
Yeah. I would take the view, it's been, I think Me Too has put it on the map. But as an issue, I think it has predated, certainly.
Yes.
Hollywood and the director's couch. And I think, for me, it's then also giving voice to the other forms of sexual harassment, exploitation, and abuse that have occurred for women in all dimensions, both in workplaces, as outworkers, as foreign workers, as, you know, in women in sexual industry as well. So I think there's a far broader issue of how do we recognise the ongoing and systemic trauma that women have experienced that's not just related to this particular movement, and what's been done about that. And how much, while this movement is effective, and it's gone from being, as Tracy Spicer said, you know, Me Too is not just the moment, it's the movement that comes with it. And I think that's really, really powerful. But for me, it's really about understanding and contextualising the breadth of this movement is far beyond what I call the Hollywood hashtag.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think, not just what's happening in Australia's media industry either, but from reports that we're hearing even about, just yesterday I read a really gruesome report about detailed abuses of Bangladeshi expat workers in Saudi Arabia, for example. And how no official there has ever been held account for the kind of abuse and the regular torture and rape and detaining that they've impacted on their workers and their staff there. And they're fleeing in droves back to Bangladesh, and the UN can't even deal with the amount of complaints that they're getting. That's that case. We're not even looking and talking about the experiences, I think, of the Indigenous women in this country and what they've endured at the hands of the state and what's going on and still goes on with Stolen Generation and kids. So I think it's, while I'm not disappointed Me Too has happened, I'm sceptical about the way that people look at this as the moment that defines this issue that has just come up now, because it hasn't.
Yeah. There's been a lot of work done on hashtag. There's a lot of work that's been done on hashtags online and offline to get us to this point of Me Too, I think.
And I would, I would even go further to say the experience of women who don't have a voice in this,
and
in
who
this
aren't even
debate
necessarily
are
online.
far greater victims of that.
And I think that was the Tarana Burke's intention 10 years before the hashtag went viral. She's an African American woman. She is talking about people who don't necessarily have that voice or don't have, so many of us have voices, but whether they're being heard, I guess, is the question. And she was talking about people who weren't being heard. And so I guess I see the hashtag as something much broader than just about Hollywood. But it becomes, what is the focus? The focus becomes the people who can be heard the most. And this is the most high profile when you start involving women whose names we recognize because they're actresses and they're on the cover of magazines. We're going to hear their stories more. But it's incredibly important to acknowledge all the women whose stories we aren't hearing. And I think that was one of the powerful aspects of Me Too, was just all the regular people who started saying, I work in the service industry and this is what happened to me, or this was that school teacher and what they did, and just how, what an epidemic this has been and continues to be.
I think Maxine Beneba-Clark, she treated something very brilliantly on this a few months back, and she said of the Me Too movement that the women who were attending the marches for the Me Too movement had their domestic staff at home, and these domestic staff at home were hoping that those women would come home before their husbands came home earlier. And that put to Me Too in a lot of context. Yeah. But she said it a lot better than that.
But
in 100 letters or something, whatever it is.
And the voices that, as you've said, just aren't being heard online. We tend to think, particularly here, that everyone is online, and that's not always the case at all. Not everyone exists online. Not everyone has the capacity to be involved in Me Too or other hashtags that have come before that.
Or has access to the devices,
access,
or
exactly.
even the freedom in their country to tweet.
Yeah, exactly. Let alone access to platforms in which change can be created. So it's not universal at all. Nothing's perfect. I want to tear down the notion of a perfect feminist movement, perfect feminist hashtag, and have critique that's actually effective, as opposed to just critique for the sake of I'm a better feminist than you.
Yeah,
absolutely. There are wanderings around which I think mean we're almost at question time. Is that correct? Excellent. That's fine. I have the clock up the back and I thought it's got to be time.
Okay, so I just wanted to invite people to come up towards the mic. We have one here for you. If you have any questions for our panellists, so just stand up and we'll sort of create, an orderly queue down the middle here. Before we do move on...
No, you can be as disorderly as you like.
I'm going to take an opportunity to ask one. One thing I'm really interested in relation to this question of agency within, telling stories around violence against women is the extent to which the legal system serves to strip women of that agency in the way that sexual violence particularly, or violence against women broadly, is dealt with by the system. They're the only person within the system that doesn't get representation or the capacity to control their own narrative. And I guess I'm interested, because you probably deal with this in relation to crime writing, but it flows on to so much of the legitimisation of the way that that's been handled broadly because of the power of the system. I wonder if you could speak to that.
In my novels, I admit I tend not to make them into legal thrillers. They tend to be a little more leaning towards the vigilante area, and I guess I feel that's relevant because the system lets these people down. So I imagine, who is this woman who survives this, and what does she do? And in the case of Mac Vanderwall, through that 6-novel series, you know, she does herself become violent, as we see with things like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and things like that. So, you know, I'm not saying this is the way to handle it. I'm saying that this is it appeared to be cathartic for some of the readers, and for me as the writer in some respects. And I can't count the number of completely awesome, particularly women and girls, but also boys who've read the books and said, you know, this helped me get through high school. Like, I had some really difficult experiences, and I read Mac, and it made me feel like I could do anything, you know, and like, screw them all, I'm coming, look out, you know. So there's a place for that. It's not a blueprint for how to handle criminal cases, but it has a place in the genre and has a place in storytelling, and that. So from that perspective, as a legal drama, it would just be really chaotic if I was in charge, because it'd be like, this is all taking too long. This is not good enough for justice. We're busting out of here and doing it our own way. Not the way to. Don't try this at home. But that is how I've tended to handle it in my novels.
Yeah, look, I think it's straight Victorian legal system. Coming back to, you know, how is the legal system here representing the experiences of survivors? I mean, there's been small gains. We can't overlook those. But I think we talk about structural, I won't say misogyny, but patriarchal structures within a system are always going to have women on the back foot, regardless of how much progress we do make. Just looking at numbers of female, you know, barristers, female judges, female, you know, the judiciary in general, and the gender balance within that speaks a lot to where final legislation lies as well. So I think small gains, but a long, long way to go.
In New South Wales, this is an interesting historical tidbit I came across the other day in my novel research. In New South Wales, it wasn't until 1946 that women were allowed to sit on juries. So think of how that works in the context of being a survivor, or perhaps you haven't survived the violence against you. And who gets to decide what happened and what should be done about it? You know, women were completely excluded from that legal process. So, you know, there's a long history that's going to take a long time to get things
structural
across the board. And forget Indigenous women.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, I think you could be admitted as a lawyer by then, interestingly, but we still didn't have female jurors. But again, only if you were a white woman.
Yeah. I've come off the back of reading 3 or 4 weeks of case law, and I am exhausted. I've been looking at image-based abuse, and content note, it often involves, we've been looking at underage image-based abuse as well. So there's been child abuse material that it's been covered in case law. I've come off the back of 2 readings about that. I am wiped. And sitting at that intersection of, you know, academia, and we're going to write research, or and in criminology, we're going to make recommendations for laws, and then as an activist just wanting to tear the whole thing down. It's this weird intersection for me of being like, well, let's look at the laws and see how we can change them and do all that kind of nice stuff, but it's so slow moving. And then on the other stage being like, let's just have a march, let's just get up there and scream down Swanston Street and see what happens that way. So I don't have an answer. I'm quite happy to be in both worlds, because one of the outcomes of my research has been you can't have change just on one level. You can never just rely on patriarchal systems to make that change for you. But you also, unless you want to burn it all down and start again, which I do, activism can help too. Activism, things like Slut Walk, that kind of stuff. These places all help as well in making that change.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm writing about oppression of women in Islam. And I have been abused, raped, and all of those things happened, but they were made right by saying, oh, God permitted me to do that. and that was not necessarily done sort of, there are men who is saying, oh, God has said that it's okay because a woman must do this and that. So through my writing, obviously my language is, even though respectful, but quite provocative. And the only example I have is Infidel and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and what happened with the submission and the rest of the stuff. So I'm afraid a little bit about what I'm getting myself into, and I just wanted your thoughts and the resources in terms of, are there any women in Australia who are writing this particular form of religious violence and violence made right in the name of Islam? And if you had any thoughts about how I could, get support, I guess. Yeah. So that was my question. Yeah. Thanks.
Anyone else have a question? I'll let you
Yeah.
if you want to come up here to the front.
Tasneem, do you
Yeah.
have any particular resources?
I'm so sorry about what you've just gone through, first of all. Second of all, in terms of religious violence, the organisation that I'm chairing, the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, that recognises religious violence occurs and that men will use and contort religion in order to justify abuse of women as an extension of how family violence is understood and consumed within the community. That said, the understanding of my understanding and the understanding that the organisation takes is there is no justification for violence or abuse in Islam. So when it is actually done, it is done to service the need and the justification for the man, as opposed to being an edict of the faith, which we do not see that as it is. So certainly within different cultures and the interpretations, that people will twist it around. It does happen. But there are strong movements of, I guess, female scholars and female intellects within Islamic frameworks who would argue against that and have successfully argued against it, to the point where rape in marriage is considered rape now in parts of the Middle East. Yeah, it's actually in Tunisia. There's some really progressive scholarship that's actually happening on this issue in other countries. It doesn't deter it from still happening within this country as a practice, and it has to be called out, and it has to be named. And it is violence, and it is a crime. And it is not justified in Islam at all. But people will claim that it is. It's a defence, obviously, that they're going to try to whip up. But to best of my experience, and I'm happy to share some resources with you afterwards, it's not cricket.
Sorry,
It's not cricket. I'm trying to find the right word. It's not acceptable, and it's not condoned. No.
I'm really sorry to hear what you have been through, and I wanted to acknowledge that, but also say that what you're doing is very brave. And also, on a related note, it's not the same thing, but it strikes me as having so many parallels with the Royal Commission and the comments there about, God made me be a pedophile. It's the abuse of power and every excuse.
Everything except identifying the perpetrator and it's their actual actions.
Yeah.
Please look after yourself. I mean, I'm sure you are as well, but yeah.
I'm just getting people to come up here for their questions. It's partly related to the speakers and the reverb. That's one of them. Thank you. And please just stick with questions just because we are a bit of a time.
My name is Roz, and I was just going to make a small comment about the women that are invisible. I work in mental health and have for many years, and so my experience every day is working with women where the trauma becomes invisible under borderline personality disorder or complex depression or PTSD, and so, epidemic, as you say. So I'm kind of, acquainted with that every day, and often sometimes with male psychiatrists that, pathologise and etc. So my question is that I'm currently about to write a memoir. I'm a survivor of domestic violence from many years ago, where I had to flee for my life in New Zealand before there was consciousness raising about it. And I've just started, I guess, to put my voice out there and be bolder and courage to speak about such things. I've performed in a play last year where I openly talked about my experience as a battered wife, as we were known in those days, many years ago. But what I find myself doing in myself is, and other people may relate to this, I go between finding courage to do this, then also being apologetic about confronting material, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on that. You know, still finding myself feeling a bit apologetic. You know, I'm sorry to disturb you with this offending content. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment, as I'm exploring my own boldness to speak in the way that I want to speak. So go between the two.
Tara, do you
Well, thank you for sharing your story and being so brave. And again, I want to say, like, people who come out and speak about this stuff are incredibly brave. It's personal and it's, you know, I'm going to say it is risky and it's, you know, takes a lot of bravery, but it's also not for everyone. Not everyone is in a position to do so, particularly at a specific time. But oh gosh, I've lost my train of thought there. It's just such a huge thing. Things have changed so much, but there's more to come. And don't let that deeply ingrained thing about women who speak up being troublemakers. Don't even let that land on you. Don't just let it. Yeah, we all have this because none of us lives in a vacuum. And we absorb all of these biases. I'm myself also. But just don't let that land on you. Don't let it be there, you know, or just go, okay, I'm getting that. That's not relevant, and push it away. And I try to remind myself of that as well. You know, if I'm talking about something and I see that it's making, frankly, the right people uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll go, no, I'm not going to edit myself for their, you know, comfort levels, because they just think, you know, a troublemaker talking up. You know, we wouldn't have got anywhere without the people who were having, you know, taking on these really uncomfortable conversations. None of us want to have, because we all wish it didn't happen.
Yeah,
right?
You're not going to approach it sensitively. You know, it's not going to happen. You will approach it in a sensitive manner, and that's demonstrated by the fact that you're up here asking us about it as well. You are going to be mindful when you're talking about this stuff, and it may cause discomfort. But as Tara said, you'll be causing discomfort to the people who probably need it, and it's not going to have a shade on the actual experiences that you've already had. So that discomfort in the right place and at the right time is really important, and what can actually lead to creation of change as well.
Yeah, I think on the issue of how violence, domestic violence specifically, is understood, I think we've, as a nation, evolved very slowly culturally from even the terminology that we used, so that even 20, 30 years ago, we talked about a domestic as if there was a fight with a house. And the domestic became domestic violence, and the domestic violence became family violence, but now we're calling it violence against women and children, which it largely is. And I think in naming it, I mean, it's uncomfortable because we keep on pushing the boundaries, and we need to. Because as Tara said, we need to make people uncomfortable with a very uncomfortable topic, because if we don't talk about it, we don't shake it up, it will continue. I mean, if we shake it up enough, it's going to agitate someone who is a victim or a survivor enough to think, this is my chance, this is my moment. It becomes a catalyst. It becomes a catalyst when you shake it up enough. I really think that on many levels. And just like with racism, the people who are most uncomfortable hearing it are racists.
Yeah.
And I think when you're talking about violence against women and children, the people in the room who are most uncomfortable negotiating it are perpetrators. So, and we don't want to play into their power by not talking about it.
On this topic, I just want to make one more short comment, which is that when, during the big storm that happened, again, it was sort of pre-Me Too, but not, depending on, you know, it's pre the viral Me Too.
Yeah.
But when all these headlines were going down, and some of them were just hard and awful headlines to suddenly see about something you really didn't want to talk to anyone about. I got a call from a friend of mine whose 10-year-old girl had been sexually assaulted. And she hadn't known this about me because I didn't talk about it with people, you know, it wasn't kind of my introduction. And she found this out about me, and she said, if this has happened to Tara too, it means I can be anyone, I can do anything. She saw someone living their life proud and strong and not being defined by that thing, and that 10-year-old girl needed to see that. So there's a lot of power in what we're doing. It's not for everyone, it's It's not for everyone, and I absolutely acknowledge that. But there is power in it. And when people say, oh, telling our own stories, and they belittle it, no, you don't get it. You haven't talked to those people, you haven't seen their faces, and how much of a difference it can make to individual lives. So it's only one of the ways in which we will change things, but God, it's a powerful one. So thank you.
Hi, I'd just like to ask around getting support, because I do a lot of advocacy work, and I know through my own experiences of harassment and sexual harassment, and I've heard a lot of stories from my community. It's very hard to get support and get your message out there. And, doing stuff through social media helps a lot. It's just finding that support, getting your message across. How can I do that in a sensitive way? Because obviously I'm talking about stuff that is probably very insensitive, or comes across as insensitive to people.
So finding support for you.
So finding support for me.
Yeah. Social media is this great and terrible beast. It's it's great in the sense that you can tell your story and get, and put it out there, but it leaves you so open to abuse and trolling and harassment at the same time. It can be great for finding support and finding other communities. It can also be terrible at the same time. In terms of finding support, we have to recognise when, in my work, some of the support services we recommend I don't personally like. Some are better than others. They're like Beyond Blue and that kind of stuff. They're not always the best when it comes to helping different people from different communities. So it's, I would say the internet in some cases, I would say relying on your friends and family and that kind of stuff. It depends on what you're after to an extent. It's really, really hard to find support that can be effective for you, and it's not always, generic services, in my opinion, aren't always the best. Yeah. They're not really good at dealing with specific experiences, and particularly like the experiences I've had can't help. The big services are so generic, they're not always helpful, and I think we need to talk about that more too. What about both of you?
Yeah, look, I think online, support groups on media platforms that are closed groups can be useful and can be relatively safe spaces, but I would also, I guess, monitor how much I wanted to share on those closed groups as well. I don't think you can replace one-to-one counselling and support, and I think if there is an opportunity for that, having both, one that's available 24 hours, which is your online group, one that you can actually have a physical appointment with, is good for your mental health and well-being as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and you have to be careful about the boundaries you have when hearing these stories coming in. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa, for your advocacy, and I see what you're doing, and we need more people doing the kind of work you're doing. I'm sorry that it's sometimes hard in the trans community and hard in feminism and imperfect. I will say that you found a really good room here. The fact that this is a great space because of the people who make it so. And I would say the Queen Victoria Women's Centre is so on it, and the Feminist Writers Festival are so on it. They probably have already, right now, a bunch of links to potential places you can go. I hope not. If not, I know they'll start typing.
They will now.
I have a few.
I think you can say they're imperfect, and that is unfortunately true. But there are some resources, and also just the amazing people we're around right now. That's. The people I've met online, the people I've met in this room and rooms like it are the people that have helped me to get through, and perhaps that might be the case for you as well.
And also the different, on face-to-face counselling is brilliant. Phone counselling is good. You can get counselling online if you're more comfortable in those mediums. So there are those different options available too. I know that some of my friends are less comfortable with face-to-face, so they would prefer to have discussions online through a chat room. So there are those different options too. Yeah.
In regards to social media, I find myself censoring myself a lot.
Yep.
Just to avoid potential backlash. So how do you negotiate being an advocate and expressing your viewpoint with the possibility of trolling, the possibility of online violence and potential real-life violence and threats? How do you deal with that? How do you make those decisions?
Everyone up here's that.
I think it. I think it can vary from person to person. In a word, you can decide what battles you want to fight. Not everything is up there for the taking. So pick your battles.
Yeah.
So pick your battles. Disable comments is a great one. And often if you're
Learn to
even if you're writing for an online journal, you can actually request them to not have comments on that article as well, if that helps your mental health, which has helped mine. Or just choose what you put on your personal page, what you put on your public page. You can make those little individual choices as well, because sadly we do live in a world where people come after your personhood, regardless of whether you're talking about a generic issue. They'll always make it personal. So I think it's, playing it smarter, being strategic about what you post, where you post it, and deciding in the first place if you really want to engage. I personally don't engage in thread arguments at all. I never have. I don't have the time or the interest, actually. I'd rather
You're not getting
sleep.
paid for it.
I'd rather sleep, personally. But I think disabling comments has been really, really helpful. And blocking, the power of the block. I don't think we should underestimate that on Twitter and otherwise. So,
And when I say, sorry, you're not getting paid for it, it comes back for me to that, because the hours that you sink into educating someone online, particularly when they don't want to be educated, they're not there to learn something different, they're there to fight. How much time do you sink into that versus doing worthwhile things? And that's me with my feminist manager's hat on. So the work I do when I look after other women, I, a lot of the time, look after their social media profiles for them. I'll do it for free for friends of mine or members of my community to the Slutwalk Melbourne page. We don't have the time for this. We'd rather be out there doing actual work. So we will, use that block button, ban people from the page, whatever else it involves to actually get our work done, because they're hurdles in that situation. And so we have to create safe spaces. Yeah. What about you, Tara?
I produced this documentary last year on cyber hate because this has become such a central and relevant topic, particularly, for people in all kinds of advocacy, human rights advocacy, across all different areas, but feminists also getting it in particularly sexualized ways. The rape death threat being so common now that it's just like, it's just the go-to for someone. I want to say someone. They are someone. They are Tara. They're someone. Even though they're doing this stuff, they seem like they're not even real people sometimes. So I would say that you just have to keep seeing how you're doing and asking, why am I doing this? I've got a great little thing on my desktop. It's just a saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, I don't have to accept the invitation to every fight, or something along those lines. And I sometimes just remind myself, when I see someone write something very, very inflammatory or horrible, I kind of go, what, if anything, will I do with that? Maybe nothing. Maybe I just like, nah, you're really trying hard, but not today.
Not today, Satan.
Exactly, not today, Satan. But other times, I think, look, for me, actually, I do want to respond, and I have the right to do that. And a lot of the narrative around when that came out, like it was a year or so ago, and it changes, the narrative always changes, but it's often very victim-blamey, and what was happening at that time was kind of like, if you respond or retweet abuse, you're just as bad as the abuser, and kind of like that you'd done something wrong and asked to be abused. That idea hasn't quite gone away, but it was a very big focus at the time, and now it's shifted to other things. And part of the point of the documentary was just to show, like, it doesn't, if someone wants to abuse you, they will keep finding ways.
They'll find a way.
It doesn't, it's not your fault. You haven't done something wrong. You haven't articulated yourself badly. You haven't been at fault. You haven't broken any laws by existing and speaking. Someone has chosen to abuse you, and sometimes in a criminal, legally criminal way. And just to keep the focus on the perpetrator and say, So I think that you have to just keep managing, like, is this okay for me right now? I don't have to. When you're baited or threatened, you have some options, and take those options. And sometimes it's just mute. Sometimes it's going to be report. Sometimes it's going to be report to police.
Yes, to be clear.
And you have the right to do that. You have the right to do that. And sometimes I'm just going to shoot back something cheeky. But if I do that, it'll be for me. It won't be because they're demanding something and I believe that their demand is valid. It'll be like, no, I feel like saying something to this.
I like, and this is following in the grand footsteps of Karen Pickering, my favourite response to those is the James Van Der Beek crying face. So Karen and I both have it saved on our desktops and we both just pop it up there when we come to trolling complaints and then block them.
Yeah, and that, they get kind of probably
They
quite
get very
mad
annoyed.
actually about that.
Great.
It's great, you know, like, so I think you need to do what you need to do for you, but being silenced is just not okay. So find a way, and maybe it's online and maybe it isn't. And I've seen certainly a lot of shift with feminists who were previously online or previously, say, columnists, and then the amount of death and rape threats they got was just enough to make them go, I'm going to keep being active in my community and I'm going to do it different ways. And that's really valid too. Just find what you have to do for you and be flexible.
And also, just a final note, rely on, if you can and if it's available to you, rely on your community, your friends, get help in that regard. So if you have public pages, get help in moderating the comments or whatever else. People can be there, and it's helped if you're a step back from it and can have someone deleting those comments or helping sort of let things through or let other things be blocked. Take a step back if it gets too big for you. And
I do love the mute button.
Oh yeah.
It's really great because like you just...
They don't know you've blocked them.
You're not seeing what they're saying anymore, but you just know they keep shouting at clouds, and you're just like, yep, I know it's one of those really super abusive people, and that's fine. They can just keep shouting at clouds and stay busy, and I'll keep doing my work. And so yeah, there's different ways to approach it, but
And there are resources out there that talk about this as well. Feminists are good at writing that stuff up.
yeah.
We are almost out of time. I'm going to take a quick question. And then at the end of the responses, I'm just going to ask everyone to please stay in your seats so that we can get our speakers out the door first. And they will go downstairs. There are readings is there with a bookshop, and there'll be some signing time. And just a reminder that we do then need to whisk Tara to a taxi into the airport so she doesn't miss her flight. And so I'm not going to come back, so I just want to say thank you all for coming today, and thank you again to our venue partner, the Queen Victoria Women's Centre. So last question, and then we'll move through our process.
Yeah.
Hi. Like everyone else, I was just after a little bit of advice. Like literally while you were talking, my friend was messaging me because we are curators and we went to a talk recently with some artists, and one of them has been messaging her constantly afterwards.
One of the artists.
Yeah, through Instagram. At first she thought he was just trying to get her to do a show, but then it was more. And one of the things she puts up, she does pole dancing as an exercise, and when she's really proud of a move, she'll put it on Instagram. And so this man has been making comments about her body and saying how strong she is and stuff like that. And she keeps telling him that he's making her uncomfortable, but he keeps messaging her. And this is not the only time this type of things happen to her in particular, but I also have another friend who has been victim of other kind of sexual harassment, and it doesn't happen to me, but it's happening to the people around me, and they always ask me for advice. And I mean, what do you do? Like, I mean, specifically the person who's messaged me right now, but and the other one as well. I mean, what do you do?
There's some good technical things I would recommend. Again, it's always a choice of how you want to handle it, and this doesn't make the abuse go away, but it can help. So in terms of the technical stuff, I'd say switch off your notifications. For example, I don't need my phone to go, ping, someone's tweeted you with, oh my God, you know.
Yeah.
I don't actually need to see that or have it like the abuse arrive in my back pocket when I'm not prepared. And so different sites should have various ways to turn off like messages that are private from people. The ones that are public are not, you're not able to avoid. So it doesn't make that go away. But there's something about the intimacy of private messages that are very abusive or pornographic, which can be really a big problem. I also have a recommendation that if possible, you try to use the public online spaces when you're in a public space. And this is just a thing I practice personally and some other people find helpful. It's not for everyone, but I wouldn't, for example, check my Twitter or Facebook in the bath or in like my bed, where it's like a personal, intimate space, and I might not be, dressed. It's when I'm ready for the day and I'm here, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to go out into the world, and it's virtually going out into the world, but it's still going out into the world, and I'm going to get what the world has for me, which is sometimes going to be really violent and sometimes going to be really amazing. But I find creating that psychological buffer is really good. So it unfortunately doesn't make abusive things go away, and it's never okay, and it shouldn't be up to you to manage it. But those are some of the things that I've personally found help me to cope. And I think that's unfortunate. What we sometimes need to do is kind of think of like, how am I going to survive this? Because things continue to be massively imperfect in this respect. And don't be afraid to report and block and mute.
Yeah, block. I would have said you can block on Instagram, so I would definitely block it. Keep a screenshot or two just for archival purposes, just in case.
Yes.
And if it has, bordered to the point of being threatening, definitely report it.
Yeah.
And you have evidence as well, so you can do that. I mean, this is just a side note, but yesterday, my mother again, she was telling me how when she gets people knocking at the door selling stuff in the evening and she gets it at the wrong time, she has a really interesting way of dealing with them. She tells them, why are you coming here? It's my meal time, I don't come to your house. And then she actually says, stay there while I get my camera. I'm going to take a photo of you and send it to the police.
That would be really effective. I love it.
And they literally run off. She just told me that last night. I was like, where did she get that from? So I mean, you can always respond with, I'm actually sending these messages to the police, FYI. Just see if it continues.
Yep. Yeah, actually keeping evidence is important. I have a rather unfortunate folder on my computer filled with garbage and vile, horrible...
Non-constructive feedback.
Yeah, it's the swamp. I call it the swamp, and I stick the stuff in the swamp, and then if someone keeps popping up, especially if like I've already blocked them, but they pop up elsewhere, and I go, that sounds like the same guy. I'll actually, maybe that will be when I will need that evidence to present a full case to whether it's the police or just that platform or whatever. So I hate doing that, though. I hate even having it in my life, like preserving it in some way, but I'll do that in cases where it seems appropriate. And unfortunately, we have to always just make these choices. Am I going to spend the time doing all the blocking? Because that in itself, like I could spend a couple of hours every Monday, sometimes I do, just like blocking the threatening stuff and reporting the illegal stuff. Like, that can be 2 hours. Like no one's paying me. It's not my job.
Why is that the theme for today?
My novel is no closer to being finished, but I have reported stuff, and then I have to deal with, whatever Twitter or whatever platform getting back to me and saying, it doesn't breach our community standards. I'm like, really? Okay, let's talk about this right now.
Yeah, well, what are your community standards?
So it takes time, but, you just have to decide whether you want to take that time, and there are lots of great ways to handle things. You just have to find out what's right for you, I think.
Not to be rude, but fuck that guy.
Oh, yeah.
What the hell? I know I have these conversations all the time. It is 2018. Where has he been for the last, decade or so? Yeah. What does he think is going to happen out of this kind of stuff? It doesn't sound like she's blocked him yet, but forgot. And also, you can, whatever path you want to go down, you can just block and delete and get rid of him and screen cap it. You can first of all just say, this is making me really uncomfortable. This is not, these comments aren't appropriate. And then, you don't need to engage in a dialogue. If you want to, fine, you can then block and delete him, call him out on his behaviour, whatever she's most comfortable with, because he's the one doing this to her. It's his fault. So she can respond in, basically whatever way she wants. And if that's, engage in a dialogue, if that's just block him, whatever she wants. But whatever she is most comfortable with. But that behaviour isn't okay, and she can remove herself from it, in whatever way she wants, and hopefully won't have any fallout as a result. Yeah.
Okay, can I ask everyone to please join me in thanking us for this podcast?
Yeah.
I also just want to give a huge shout out to our volunteers who have been so amazing in the lead up and on the day today. Our next session today is actually sold out, but there are still some tickets available at the door tomorrow if you don't yet have a ticket and would like to come along. Conscious Closet, who are located downstairs, have offered attendees a discount of 25% on their op shop downstairs today. They're open till 5, and your code word is Everyday Rebellion.
Nice.
So now we're going to move into the book signing. So as I mentioned earlier, if you could just remain seated for a moment, our speakers will make their way downstairs, and we'll have a brief time with Tara and a little bit more of an extended time with the other two. And thank you so much for coming today.
Let's go.